When you look back on the story of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the rising of the Iron Curtain, one reporter stands out. He is Misha Glenny, and he is a writer and a broadcaster, and he joins us now on INSEAD Knowledge from the Bloomberg Businessweek European Leadership Forum in London. Welcome to INSEAD Knowledge, Misha. Thanks very much for being with us. Let's look at the book that you've just written, McMafia, because that's kind of making money quickly in another kind of robbery, perhaps. But also in some of the areas that you're talking about, the people who understood the free markets were, in the old system, criminals. So,
and indeed in the new system. I mean, but what McMafia attempts to do is to act as a sort of first map to try and explain what happened in the world after 1989 to all the countries, most immediately the East European and former Soviet countries, but also quite dramatically elsewhere, South Africa, Brazil, India, China, what happened to them in a period of rapid economic transition. Because when you have a rapid economic transition from planned economies or highly regulated economies to extremely fluid ones, where trade possibilities with other countries in particular open up very, very quickly, is you have a huge legal grey area as to what is licit business and what is illicit business. And when you have a weakening of the state, as you had in Eastern Europe, you had the de facto collapse of the state in Eastern Europe, that means as contract law and the free market come in, it's very difficult to know which instance is responsible for regulating that trade. And so what happened is you got what I refer to in a rather sort of dour sociological way as privatized law enforcement agencies emerging, but we call them historically a mafia, well, since the second half of the 19th century anyhow. That is people who would sell their services, their protection services, to the new businessman because the courts and the police force did not have the capacity or indeed the knowledge or understanding of how to do this. And so you get a surge in goods of all sorts, but illicit goods are particularly lucrative. I guess finally what I'd say about McMafia is the importance is to recognize that you have coherent industries in the underground economy, that you have areas of production like Afghanistan or Colombia, to take two of the most obvious because of heroin and cocaine. You have areas of distribution, the Balkans and Mexico, and the violence associated with the Balkans in the 1990s and in Mexico today are directly related to their role as central distribution zones of illicit goods and services. And then, of course, you have the areas of retail or consumption, to wit, Western Europe, the United States, where you have people with, in relative terms, large sums of money and lots of cash that they want to spend on taking drugs or sleeping with prostitutes.
Has the underground economy become a global force to be reckoned with?
I think it is a global force to be reckoned with for two particular reasons. And two sectors of this industry. One is the issue of intellectual property rights and the fact that China and East Asia counterfeit huge amounts of goods whose intellectual copyright resides primarily in the United States, Western Europe and Japan. And this is a big, big issue between the major forces of the global economy, the United States, the emerging economies of Asia. And this plugs directly into the underground economy, the whole issue of piracy. So that is the first thing. The second thing, which we've seen a dramatic rise in since 2008, since the Lehman Brothers collapse, is the issue of financial fraud and cybercrime. And what we've seen in the reason why you're seeing such a growth in cybercrime is partly because of the fundamental discrepancy in wealth around the world between countries and within countries, but it is also because traditional organized crime groups have discovered that they can move away from the often risk-laden business of commodity and services, i.e. drugs and trafficking human beings and this sort of thing, over to crime in the virtual world, where their chances of being caught by the police are really very low indeed. And the profits are absolutely incredible, such that we saw in the United States in the first half of, or the second half of 2009, $17.5 million were physically stolen from banks, i.e. a guy walking in with a shotgun and saying, you know, hand over the cash. In one particular heist of a so-called payroll infiltration by a single Ukrainian group, $45 million were taken from banks and major corporations around the United States in the same period. So, as you can see, when you're looking at that sort of profit margin today, as opposed to the more traditional, method of bank hold-ups, then it's obvious that fairly soon serious organised crime organisations are going to say, right, okay, cyber is the way that we go for part of our operation. The figures that I used, I put it down to 15% of the global economy, but the figures that I use, you have to bear in mind what that includes. And it's culled from academic institutions and from the global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and all put together. This includes traditional things like drugs, you know, prostitution and so on and so forth, but it also includes corruption, because it's impossible to extract corruption from the activity of organised crime. And corruption is a vast industry worth, according to the UN now, about $3 trillion a year. But I also have to include a large part of what goes on in the offshore banking sector, because despite the, you know, the almost divine deference given to offshore banking sectors by the licit world, governments have to understand that this is a carte blanche for money launderers and people seeking to get money out of the black economy and into the white economy. And this is also where a lot of the banking scams go on, and the money comes together in those offshore centres and is very, very difficult to track by state and tax institutions.
And what's dangerous now about what you see?
One is always influenced, of course, by the daily headlines, but I think the crisis of confidence in the euro is a really major issue that we're facing, and I think it reflects the consequences of hubris on the part of Western Europe and the United States and the Western banking system and financial capitalism in general, which believed that it could dictate a policy that saw large sums of money made in a very short space of time without regard to what the consequences were. But actually what this is, I suspect, is a factor in the relative decline of the West. I don't mean that the West is going to disappear by any stretch of the imagination, but a relative decline against the major emerging economies, essentially the BRIC economies, but particularly Brazil, India and China.
Misha Glenny, thank you very much for being with us on INSEAD Knowledge.
You're welcome.